very pleased to introduce today Benjamin Hoy, who will be delivering our seminar series talk. Dr. Hoy is an associate professor of history at the University of Saskatchewan, where he also directs the historical GIS lab. To give you a bit of background, Dr. Hoy received his PhD from Stanford University in 2015, and his research examines the creation, demarcation, and enforcement of the Canadian-United States border between 1775 and 1939. Ben's work explores the contributions that Indigenous communities made to the extension of federal power and the uneven impact the border ultimately had on Europeans, African Americans, Chinese, Cree, Lakota, Dakota, Métis, Coast Salish, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe communities. Dr. Hoy's research on the Canada-US border culminated in his monograph, A Line of Blood and Dirt, creating the Canada-United States border across Indigenous lands, which won the very prestigious Governor General's History Award for Scholarly Research in 2022. A Line of Blood and Dirt has also won numerous prizes from the Canadian Historical Association and the American Historical Association. I know some of you in the room right now were also at the CHA Roundtable for the best scholarly book in Canadian history, held for Dr. Hoy's book at CHA earlier this spring. I also wanted to mention that our department's own previous Buchanan postdoc fellow, Max Hammond, interviewed Ben about his book back in 2021 for a podcast series he produced called Policing the Border. And you can find the link to that talk and the other podcast talks on the department website. And for a more personal side of things, as many of you know, I received my PhD from the University of Saskatchewan. And in fact, Dr. Hoy was on my PhD committee. And I was really glad he was. I really valued the feedback and guidance he provided, and indeed of all my committee members, I guess aside from my supervisor, Dr. Hoy gave me the most substantial feedback, which I really valued at that stage of my career. So it is indeed with a very absolute pleasure to welcome here today, to my home here at Queen's. So thank you very much for being here, Ben. And with that, maybe we could all welcome him and pass the floor over to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, for the warm welcome and for so many of you coming out. I know this is probably midterm time for you, so this is really wonderful to see. I'm really excited to be sharing this research with you today. You're actually the first group that I'm presenting this to. So this is some brand new research that came out of a number of different things that I'll talk about in a moment. But I really wanted to thank three organizations and some co-authors who made all of this possible. Almost all of my work is collaborative, and it's not possible without SHRF, Canadian Foundation of Innovation, and the Harry Guggenheim Foundation, who provided a lot of the money to create the maps that I'm going to show you today. And I'd also like to thank Anna Gibson, who's at Durham University, and Alan Robeser, who were undergraduates and graduate students at the time, for doing some of the work that went into this. So this is very much, like I said, a collaborative project, and it's really important to me to highlight that this isn't the work of one person. And finally, as is customary, I'd like to recognize that this research was completed on Treaty 6 lands in the homeland of Métis, and is being presented on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. I hope this presentation will change the way you maybe think about that land acknowledgement by showing that it's not just something that's said. That the work that I'm doing here is hopefully showing why the land was dispossessed and the speed at which it happened. So I hope for those reasons, talking about soldiers and logistics, which I know are not the most exciting topics, will change the way that you think about land. So like I said, military logistics is not one of those things where as a young child you're like, today when I grow up I want to be a logistics historian, right? That's not one of those dreams in the same way that you're never like, I'm going to grow up to be a census historian, right? These are not the kinds of topics that excite many of the people, right? Logistics like taxes are dull, they are nuanced, and they are impossibly complex. Their power is from their details, which fill thousands of boxes of ledger sheets. But for as boring as logistics can be, I think they're nonetheless important to talk about. Logistics, as I hope to show you today, explain the staggering rates of desertion the US Army would face and its decision to abandon frontier posts. They help explain why soldiers are so unbelievably ineffective at controlling day-to-day movements of Indigenous communities, and why soldiers seem to operate through so much of their time, the time period I'm talking about, at a fraction of their on-paper strength. Logistics, at their core, are about power, and it's about control. And with it, the ability to change the distribution of wealth and power across entire continents. So if logistics doesn't get your blood boiling, hopefully the power to shape continents might. Now, like I said, I don't think many historians come into logistics honestly. My interest in military logistics comes from two very different places. My own family's history, and the second was my own failings as a scholar. So as a child, I grew up hearing about stories about my uncle's experience as a soldier during the Vietnam War. And although he fought in some of the deadliest battles in the war, the stories he tells focus on food, not on death. He tells stories about the men in his company studying ration containers like this one, flipping them over to figure out not only where was the ration produced, but when. You did not want rations produced in Los Angeles. They were almost inedible. If you had your choice, you chose them from Georgia. And he tells stories of soldiers pawning off rations to one another, pawning off bad vintages to newer soldiers who didn't know better, and hoarding the nicer rations for themselves. Those weren't the stories I was expecting from a man who served in 3 or 4 of the worst battles in Vietnam. So this is a picture of my uncle on my right, your left, and a picture of my grandmother. My uncle has hundreds of interesting stories to tell about the war, but the ones he likes most were the food that my grandmother sent him. Now, to give you a bit of background, to save on money and to maintain control over large areas in Vietnam, the US kept thousands of soldiers in the field for very long periods of time. For soldiers like my uncle, this meant eating ration-packed day after day. We're talking canned eggs and ham, canned lima beans, canned bread. Canned bread. Hot food for him was a once-a-year luxury. Now, my uncle never relayed any of this back to my grandmother, and her letters to him revealed her own ignorance of the conditions that soldiers faced. She would ask if he slept in a bunk or on a cot. She would ask him if he carried a gun. He didn't tell her that every night he slept in muddy foxholes in the jungle, and he didn't tell of the people he killed or of the friends he lost. And while she didn't understand the violence, she understood the power of food. My grandmother spent her whole life poor, but whatever she could save up, she would send overseas. She sent Pepsi, roast beef, oysters, canned fruit, peanut butter, chocolate chip cookies, all sent deep into the jungle through military supply networks to my uncle and the men he served with. In perhaps his most comical story, my grandmother decided to send him this, Chef Boyardee pizza mix, to a bunch of men in the jungle who have no access to an oven. When they wrote back and said, "We have absolutely no way to cook this," she sent them an 8-inch frying pan, all through military networks. So my uncle's company are sitting in the jungle, and they make this pizza with dirty water and an intense fire made by shaving C4 that they'd removed from a claymore mine. In the sense, the very machinery of war became the tools needed to ease their aching stomachs. And as silly as this story may sound, my uncle is adamant that the food that my grandmother sent him helped keep him alive. Not only did the food add substance and variety to a ration that was insufficient at the best of times, but it ensured that he had something to share with those around him. Everyone understood that if my uncle died, no one was getting chocolate chip cookies and no one was getting pizza anymore. So that's the first motivation for my interest in military logistics, was hearing stories like this growing up. The second sort of piece of this, I suppose, is some of the research challenges I ran into when writing my book on the Canada-US border. And as part of that book, I became very interested in trying to map the networks of power. Right, a border on a map often looks like a thin line, but in practice it looks something more like this. So at the top is, the green circles are Northwest Mounted Police, and the lines that connect them are their patrol routes. So that's sort of the web of control that you see. In the bottom, in blue, you see US Immigration, in dark blue, Customs and Treasury, pink is US Military, and orange is Department of Indian Affairs. This is what a border looks like. These are the people who enforce order. It's a little bit more complicated than this because humans have this awful habit of moving around. This is more sort of mailing addresses, but it gives you a sense of sort of nodes of power that make things possible. This workover left me with more questions than answers. For all the soldiers that I had mapped, they seemed to be important only a fraction of the time. They mattered during times of war, and they were capable of projecting intense amounts of fear. But in day-to-day matters, neither the Northwest Mounted Police nor the American Army seemed capable of influencing day-to-day life in the ways that I was expecting. And those failures my uncle's experienced pushed me to consider the challenges that soldiers faced and the logistical networks that supplied them. Or maybe to put this more simply, if soldiers were spending their time doing something other than soldiering, what on earth were they doing? So in 1818, the House of Representatives in the United States noted that food sustains, quote, the immense machinery of war. Soldiers who lacked ammunition could fight with their bare hands or improvised weapons. Soldiers without food became empty husks within days. Those without water, even quicker. So this sentiment in my uncle's experience 100 years later made me wonder if the Army's inability to supply its soldiers with adequate food, water, and housing helped explain the kind of herky-jerky colonialism, for lack of a better term, that I was running into. The map here gives you a sense of the challenges that the US military faced. So each of the little black dots is an Army post, and the lines that connect them are the supply lines that provide the food that keeps those posts running. Brown are supplied by wagons, gray is supplied by railways, dotted lines are a combination of multiple sources, and blue are over water. This is the backbone of military power. This is the supply network that made the dispossession of Indigenous lands possible. Now the task of maintaining that supply network, right, that backbone that makes colonialism possible, falls on a very weird and unusual department, right, the quartermasters. Their task is fueling the American war machine. But this is, like I said, a really weird department. It has only about 100 dedicated officers and storekeepers. It relies on more than 800 soldiers and non-commissioned officers who are roped in and have very little experience. But most importantly, it relies on 14,000 civilian contractors. The system becomes enormously flexible, right? When you're relying on civilian contractors, you can pick them up in the area you need food in, and you can dump them as your needs change. As you can imagine, though, when you have 100 sort of dedicated people to maintaining this and 14,000 people to look after, there's enormous opportunities for corruption. And if you're interested, I can tell you some of the stories about that. Worse still, though, was a reliance on untrained soldiers rather than professional clerks to handle a lot of the day-to-day logistics. This meant that supplies often ended up damaged, lost, or left to spoil. And the trick of this is you need four things to keep an army or an administration working in essentially foreign lands. The first thing you need to know is how many soldiers you have, right? How many mouths you're trying to feed. The second is you need to know how much food a soldier eats. You need some way of transporting the food, and I showed you sort of the infrastructure and railways that supplied that. And then you need some way to prepare and store food. And you would think that would be somewhat easy, but when you're operating at a continental scale, all of these questions become extremely difficult. The problem with feeding soldiers is that the US government is never sure how big its army is. And that sounds kind of crazy, I think, to you, where you're like, well, surely they have payrolls. Well, let me give you some examples. So in 1869, so right after Canadian Confederation, right after the American Civil War, the US has an official capacity of about 43,000 soldiers. But desertion, illness, turnover, and other challenges mean that about 30,000 are in the field at any given time. And even if you could pin down the exact number of soldiers who needed food a bit more precisely, you need to figure out how much a soldier needs to be fed. And the US, this is the US government's best guess at the time on what you should probably feed a soldier. So we're talking about, this is per day, about a pound of meat, about a pound of bread, some beans, some sugar, and it works out to be about 3,000 calories or so. But this is actually a lot more tricky than it sounds. Right, in practice, did you serve fish or mutton instead of beef? Right, there's all kinds of local substitutions that are going to change the dietary needs or things that a soldier will receive. And a lot of that makes sense to you, right? Well, you're giving them some kind of meat, that's good. But the substitutions they made got really weird sometimes. So soldiers either received pickles or 4 times their weight in vinegar. Not exactly the same thing, presumably so they could make their own pickles. But if you were one of the unlucky soldiers who received vinegar and you did not have cucumbers, that's not exactly helpful. So some rough napkin math, like I said, puts this around 3,000 calories a day with about 142 grams of protein. That's enough to sustain an adult male who's getting regular exercise, but it falls well short of what the US Army offers its soldiers today, which is about getting close to 4,000 calories. Right? So they need to supplement their diet. And worse still, and this is where things get very weird, soldiers didn't receive all of the ration that had been promised them. And the problems, oddly enough, start at the bakeries. So in theory, every soldier is supposed to receive a ration for flour. But as I think all of you can imagine, if I handed you a bag of flour, you would not be very pleased with me. So instead, soldiers received the ration as bread. And for simplicity, they were given the same weight of bread as the weight of flour they were supposed to receive. But those two things are not the same. When you bake bread, you add flour, water, oil, and all sorts of other ingredients. In the end, this meant that the bakeries ended up with more flour at the end of the day than bread they distributed. And this extra weight was sold to create what was called a post fund. And this post fund would pay for all kinds of things: garden seeds, utensils, a gymnasium, a chapel, fruit trees, printing presses, instruments for the band. Or to put this another way, American soldiers received about 2/3 of their bread ration as food. The remaining 1/3 they received as musical instruments or books or other amusements. So you can see why you don't know how many soldiers you have, and even if you were giving them the ration, they're not actually receiving all of the ration as food. It becomes very difficult to figure out, are they getting enough to sustain life? So you can see why this creates some problems. Faced with these difficulties, US medical officers attempted to create more practical estimates, relying not on the rations on paper, but on what soldiers were receiving in practice. In 1887, Surgeon Joseph R. Smith, for example, set out to study 87 different companies in the Department of Texas over 17 months, trying to figure out what on earth are these men eating. But then you run into the problem, right? If we were talking about trains and how much coal they run through, right, that's a pretty standard set of calculations, but the human body is incredibly complex. Food differed in nutritional value for hundreds of different reasons. Pork, for example, even the same cut contains different amounts of water and fat, meaning you can't just base nutrition off of weight. Flour from different varieties contain different nutritional compositions. All of those metrics change as food ages. All of them change as you process it when you're salting or pickling things. Even the cooks themselves changed the value of food. Give the same ingredients to an untrained chef and they wasted copious amounts of the food that was meant for soldiers compared to a trained chef who was better. Even if you could sort out all of that, the individual who was consuming the food responded to it differently. Every soldier required a different amount of food, they processed it more or less efficiently, and they had different needs in terms of overall nutrients. And appetite, unfortunately, is another terrible metric for trying to figure out how much a soldier needs. As Smith noted, the glutton eats for the love of eating, and one person will starve on what will amply nourish another. And you could do it on body weight to get some quick estimates, the body weight of the soldier, but that differs by body composition, workload, individual idiosyncrasies, external temperature, elevation, health, food intolerances. You get my picture. This is really, really hard to do, and if you mess this up, people die. Smith's conclusion was that while it's hard to measure food in a scientific way in the short term, it was really easy to figure it out in the long term. Soldiers who ate too many calories gained weight. Soldiers who didn't eat enough lost weight, got injured, or struggled to work. The image here gives you a sense of how variable the diet of world armies at the time could be. Some diets, like the Italian army, advocated for a ratio of 17:1 carbohydrates to fat. Other armies in the world advocated for 1.6:1 ratio. So across the world, across all these armies who are dealing with the same problem, there's absolutely no consistency on what you should feed soldiers, in what quantities, or in what distribution. I'm afraid the problems just keep getting worse. You don't know how many soldiers you have very little idea of what to feed them, and storing the food, right? This is the 19th century, you're getting the start of refrigerated cars, but storing food long term is really, really tricky. But storing and preparing food becomes a real disaster. So you're relying on civilian contractors and untrained soldiers to manage and store food. And despite almost yearly recommendations to hire trained cooks, the army refuses to do so. Fort Benton would run out of vegetables. Fort Concho would have rotten potatoes. The beef that showed up in Wyoming was mostly bone, and what arrived in Fort Clark, Texas, on several occasions was, quote, blood-sodden and soft, as though the animals were overdriven before slaughter. Fort Laramie had bread so musty it was not fit for consumption, and Fort Grant, Arizona, stored their butter next to the kerosene, and the flavor was imparted so badly that it was deemed unfit for human consumption. Investigations into the civilian operations who supplied the military with their food returned some pretty disconcerting findings. At Fort Sheridan, the post's milk supply, for example, came from the civilian contractors whose cows were caked in manure and drank water contaminated by both their urine and their feces. These challenges encouraged post commanders to look far distant to places like Chicago, which were much more expensive to get food from, but where sanitation and food preparation standards were much higher. Even in the situations where the food arrived in good condition, its preparation could cause problems. Fort Robinson, Nebraska experienced an outbreak of diarrhea when the cooks left apples stewing in a copper kettle for 24 hours. Undercooked or raw meat consumption caused outbreaks of tapeworm at Fort Reno, Indian Territory. And for those of you who are drinking coffee today, I hope this will give you a visceral sense for how bad these cooks could be. Untrained cooks at Fort Grant, Arizona were so absent-minded in the preparation of coffee that it ended up filled with charcoal and was almost odorless and tasteless. But worst of all was the pork. No matter who you were or what you liked, the military salted and pickled pork drew condemnation. It was so bad that pork alone caused people to desert. Each year, medical officers across Texas sent urgent letters to the Department of War demanding that they stop sending pork, which in their professional opinions was detrimental to the health and morale of troops. They noted that the soldiers refused to eat it once it hit Texas's almost tropical climates, and they were unable to sell it to anyone nearby. The pork was composed almost entirely of fat, and was seen by medical doctors in the area as neither nutritious nor palatable. So each year, medical officers complained, and each year the Department of War sent another shipment. It got so bad that the doctors sent letters saying, "Why do you even have us? When all of us say this is not worth having, and every year you keep sending more." And if salted pork was bad, the pickled pork was worse. When the mess is served it, great slabs of it are left uneaten. It was eventually cut up, put into pies or hash or disguised in beans and cabbages, and finally gotten rid of. Only the best cooks could find ways to make the men choke it down, but neither the men nor the medical staff thought it was appropriate. Even in the most northern posts, up near Fort Benton, Montana, elsewhere, where you might want very high caloric food, right, to get you through the winter, where that might have been the most welcome place for pickled pork. The soldiers there and their officers deemed it not fit for the human stomach, quote, no matter how it was prepared. So if the Army's facing a lot of challenges with food and figuring out how many soldiers it has, and it's struggling to figure out what soldiers need on a day-to-day basis, what are the impacts, right? Why do we care, right? These soldiers are miserable, but they've been dead 100 years at this point. Well, these food issues cause desertion, unhappiness, illness, and injury, but that's only part of the problem. If all that soldiers had to worry about was food, we might have seen a different picture. But we also had issues over water. So failing to meet the water requirement of soldiers and their animals results in your army just wandering before you. Water is uniquely challenging. It is unbelievably heavy, it is irritating to store, and if you aren't careful, it contains all kinds of horrible waterborne illnesses. And worse still, humans and animals go through an absolutely shocking amount of water when working heavy labor jobs. In hot climates, a human can go through 3 to 4 liters per hour and as much as 10 liters per day doing heavy exercise. That's 25 pounds of water per day per person without even talking about horses. So this got me really curious. Like, does water give us some idea of what's happening across the US military? And so Anna Gibson and I, who I mentioned at the start, who was doing some work with me from Durham University, decided we were going to try and measure the water supply of the US military. Could we figure out where some of these challenges are coming from? And like most of the historic problems that I've worked on, I thought this was going to be really easy. This was going to be a 2-week task for an undergraduate, and we've now spent many, many months, and we're still trying to figure it out. So maps like this give us a sense of where the US military gets its water. So Anna and I tried to set out and map soldiers' access to water over time using 2 very simple metrics. We looked at the ease of access, how much work did a soldier have to do to get the water they needed to live, and how bad was that water that they had access to. So for example, the worst condition for getting access to water would be hand carrying buckets of water multiple miles. That sounds like among the worst things that you could do when you need 25 pounds of water per person per day. That's just miserable. And maybe the best example of water that's accessible would be a well right in the middle of the post that you just go to and grab water as you needed it. And we did the same thing with water quality. Water sources that were filled with dead animals, we deemed as bad. Water sources that were clean spring water, we deemed as good. And you can imagine there's some nuance in the in-between period, but we were just doing sort of rough estimates. Where is the bad water, and does it match where we're seeing bad food? And we were feeling pretty good about how things looked after our first pass. So this image gives you 3 different maps, and I'll explain them, I guess, one at a time. So in 1871, the US Army did this really interesting thing where they went post by post and wrote 1 to 2 pages on the conditions. What are the houses like? What is the water like? Did they have a mail post? Things like that. And so we assessed, as best we could, how far away did they have to get water, and was it good quality? And that's from the top map. And you can see that in the American Southwest near Texas, we have some difficulty sourcing water, which doesn't surprise me too much at all. The map in the middle, we found some additional information from 1876 that we supplemented the material from 1881 or 1871 with. So essentially the 1876 material clarified in some of the cases where we didn't have a distance, how far away they're getting their water. And then the last map is taken from this. So we found a map that already talked about water by post. And we mapped that, and we're seeing some really interesting patterns. It looks like, over time, it got easier and easier to get access to water, especially in the American Southwest. This seemed like a positive thing. The US military, after the Civil War, recognized that it had all of these logistical problems. It invested some money into pipes and other things, and our soldiers are doing better in 1890. And we could simplify this map even more. So this is the map with only the problem areas. So anything that is in red was a place where water took enormous amounts of effort to gather. Anything with an X is water that is of bad quality. And anything that is a red X is water that you have to work very, very hard to get very, very poor water. So sucks to the soldiers living in anything with a red X. And again, you'll see we have a concentration in the American Southwest, and then we have sporadic posts. But most of what we're seeing is the problems are west of the Mississippi River, which again, you probably suspect. So this was really exciting to me. The concentration I was seeing at first glance matched the rates of absences from posts that I was seeing in the military records. Or maybe to put this another way, was the phrase absent from post a reflection of the awful conditions that soldiers were experiencing? Was it just code for sickness or desertion? Remember, the American Southwest is where you're getting the worst of the pickled pork. You can imagine this awful pork sitting in Texas's hot sun without refrigeration, right? Just like revolting. And they have bad access to water, and we're seeing the number of soldiers absent from that area very high. This seemed to make a lot of sense to me. We could also map how water was changing over time. So this map shows an improvement of access over time, which again matched our expectations. During this time period, the United States would introduce machinery like pumps, ice dispensers, and hydraulic rams that made water, in theory, safer and easier to acquire. So on the top, we see we're still getting a lot of challenges, and by the end, we're seeing most of the water across all of the United States that soldiers are drinking is machine sourced, right? So it seemed like everything was looking up. So we're feeling good. We have some really interesting regional patterns, and we had a clear explanation of how the US Army improved access to food and water over time. And maybe the main takeaway from all of these maps was that early on, the primary issue the American Army was facing was the physical transportation of water, a problem that was easily rectified by pipes and machines, replacing barrels and wagons. I suspect for many of these sort of experienced historians in the room, you know that it doesn't end easy. It's just a painful, painful process. So as we began to look deeper into the historic sources and moved away from the sources that were easiest to map, it became less and less clear that the rosy depiction that we were seeing was actually true. And I want to show you Fort Custer as maybe the prime example of this. So Fort Custer is built in 1877 in southwestern Montana in response to the Army's defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn. The fort exists almost exclusively to subdue Indigenous people. And the data set that we were working with didn't have a lot of information on Fort Custer. We knew it had a waterworks, and we knew it drew from the Little Bighorn River into large tanks at the post. And those are certainly true. But left out of the sources that were easiest to map is the fact that the post's machinery drew water from a section of the Little Horn River that was contaminated with rotten meat from a slaughterhouse at the Crow Agency. And the annual reports made this abundantly clear year after year, reporting in 1890, 1893, 1896, and 1897. And by this point, by 1897, sewage had also contaminated the water supply. Between 1897 and 1898, Fort Custer experienced more cases of typhoid than any other post in the United States, and accounted for about 16% of all cases across the entire country in that one post. It was only open 5 months of that year. The post commander blamed his men, noting that the soldiers did not appreciate the danger when they drank directly from the post tanks, and that he had recommended that they boil it instead. Even if the soldiers had listened, I don't know that it would have been much better. The water itself was so acidic that it eroded pipes and caused dental problems for all of the troops at the post. 5 months after the commander's comments, the Army abandoned Fort Custer due to poor quarters, sanitary conditions, and a lack of usable water. For those of you thinking, Well, it's good for the soldiers. Maybe not. Life for the soldiers at Fort Custer does not seem to have gotten any better. Anyone healthy enough to continue serving was shipped to Fort Harrison, 300 miles northwest, where they again drank water contaminated and where they again suffered from typhoid. Fort Custer is an example of an endemic problem in the data sets that we had been using. This is where the soldiers ended up. While post records and maps were wonderful ways to do things like mapping because they standardized information and they gave a national overview, they often lacked details necessary to assess the problems. They ranged in detail as little as what you see on Fort Custer here, which you can imagine gives us very little to map. We know that they had a waterworks, but we don't know much else. The annual reports, on the other hand, give us a tantalizing taste of a much more useful set of information about these posts and some of the problems, but they only gave us anecdotes. They didn't give us a national level from which we could compare. They did, like I said, challenge our assumptions about the ways that machinery improved the lives of soldiers. And to see what I mean, I want to zoom in on Fort Clark, Texas, which I've talked about before. Throughout the 1880s, soldiers at Fort Clark, Texas are consuming pond water contaminated with rotting vegetable matter, which you can imagine only exacerbates the extreme heats they're facing in Texas. In the summer of 1889, the military installed an ice condenser at the post, but in an effort to keep the machinery as cheap as possible, the condenser drew from the exhaust of the engine instead of the boiler direct. And that's a little bit technical, but this part is not. In practice, this meant that the pump returns water that was milky orange in color on account of contamination with beeswax lubricant and engine rust. Later reports suggest that the soldier preferred the rotting pond water over the upgraded water created by the condenser. And when the Army did make improvements, they were selective. In 1890, the camp commander at Fort Reno drew attention to the high rates of sickness amongst post troops, but noted, curiously enough, that all of the officers remained healthy. 3 years later, the situation was no better. Officers continued to drink distilled water piped in from a natural springs. Ordinary soldiers continued to only have access to a contaminated well. So why do we care? Right, I'm telling you about the suffering of soldiers more than 100 years ago. What does this have anything to do with the life that you live today? Well, for the soldiers themselves, poor food and water contributed to extremely high rates of desertion. In the 5 years between 1883 and 1887, almost 15,000 soldiers deserted from an army that was never larger than 25,000 people in size. We are talking staggering levels of desertion that are higher than anything you'll see in Germany, France, or Italy at the time. Many of them ate so poorly that one general believed that the Army needed to shut down its military prison at Fort Leavenworth because incarcerated soldiers there had better housing, they labored less, they ate better than the faithful soldiers that remained at their post. In his estimation, Fort Leavenworth was acting as an encouragement for desertion, not a deterrent, because nothing was worse than what you're seeing. Now, whatever the case, the desertions are causing high rates of turnover, chronic personnel shortages, and a constant stock of new recruits who are often liabilities to those around them. You have a chart here that gives you some of the rates of desertion over time. Second, because soldiers had such poor access to food and water, they ended up spending most of their lives rectifying those problems rather than actually soldiering. Undersupplied soldiers diverted their energies to filling in gaps. They cut their own firewood and hay when the subsistence department failed to supply them with enough food and fuel to make it through the winter. They spent their time caring for cows and pigs, hunting, cultivating vegetables and other crops, and bartering away whatever gross food they received for something a little bit more palatable. The gardens I'm talking about are not small. Before Fort Custer closed, for example, soldiers had 13 acres under cultivation, that they filled with beets, turnips, cabbage, cauliflower, corn, pumpkins, squash, tomatoes, parsnips, beans, and carrots. Like my uncle, they found other ways to get the food that the army had denied them. In 1883, Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry estimated that soldiers were so undersupplied that the force was forced to gather $150,000 worth of fuel, hay, and forage just to make it through the winter. So soldiers are spending a lot of their time collecting food, fuel, and water, and they're deserting in very high numbers. So in practice, both the desertion and the focus on gathering supplies diminished both the speed and intensity of colonialism. It diverted soldiers away from the primary tasks like enforcing order or punishing settlers who illegally occupied Indigenous lands. It forced the United States Army to spend large parts of its time chasing down deserters rather than actually doing the jobs it first set out to do. Although this is a little bit hard to see, there's quite a few maps going on here. This is sort of where my research is going from here. So the top map is the distribution of US soldiers in two different time periods. On the left is 1883, on the right is 1885. Below that are all of the interracial killings that the Department of Indian Affairs was able to record. So these are settlers killing Indigenous people killing settlers. Below that are the arrests of Indigenous people, and below that, it's a little bit hard to see, but the arrests of settlers. We can start overlaying the distribution of soldiers with things like the water and food they received, and then their impact on the kinds of things we can measure. Right? Where are people dying? Do soldiers have any impact at all on reducing interracial violence? Do they have any impact at all on the illegal occupation of Indigenous lands? Preliminary results suggest they have a far smaller impact than I first imagined, and I think food and water may help explain why. The second reason that I think all of this matters is the persistence of these problems changed the nature and shape of the American military presence in the West. Constant issues over food and water convinced US military brass about the need to centralize the force as much as possible. This pulled US military out of many communities and shrunk their presence to an ever smaller number of locations. In practice, this made it harder for soldiers to observe day-to-day movements and influence day-to-day activities in the way that they could in the past. Now finally, I know many of you are interested in Canadian history, not necessarily US history. These struggles have implication for Canada as well. Although I don't think this is super well known, it's American infrastructure and supply lines that are vital to Canada's own colonial ventures. When the Northwest Mounted Police make their trek west, it's on American railways that they make their first journey. When the Northwest Mounted Police are receiving their Christmas dinner and their mail, it's through American supply lines that they're supplied. When Canada is fulfilling its treaty promises to Indigenous people around rations, these aren't always coming from Toronto or Montreal. Instead, merchants like I.G. Baker, who operate out of Fort Benton, Montana, are fulfilling Canada's commitments to Indigenous people. Unsurprisingly, the same logistical problems that vexed the American government will soon vex the Canadian one. In 1883, rancid salted pork would make its way into an Assiniboine community near Indian Head, causing illness. That same year, 20 kini died from tainted flour supplied by the Canadian government. In both cases, these were supplies sent by I.G. Baker. In that sense, persistent issues in American supply lines had a continental impact, shaping not only the distribution of soldiers and Northwest Mounted Police officers throughout the continent, but both countries' relationship with Indigenous people for years to come. I want to end off with a gift to you. I know you've sat through something on logistics, and it's one thing to tell you about this, but I want to give you the opportunity to learn it viscerally. So I've included my favorite recipe from the US Army Cookbook. This is beef tea number 2. There are 2 recipes because one is not enough. It involves soaking 3/4 of a pound of lean steak in a pint of cold rainwater for half an hour, squeezing it occasionally, putting it on a fire, boiling it slightly, removing the scum, and serving it hot. So if you ever want to feel that taste of the US military, maybe start with this one. I'll save you the salted pork for those who make it through the first one. But thank you very much.
Hi, Tony DeLee. I do early modern European history and the classical tradition. But I had two questions. I'm sure when did chlorination come in? Because I thought it was just coming in around this time. And couldn't they use that to treat the water? Wouldn't that have solved the problems? And the other question that's related is, what about chickens? Couldn't they just have live chickens rather than, pork or whatever? I don't know. What about bringing chickens? I don't know.
Yeah, so I don't know when they introduced chlorination, but they do put all kinds of other chemicals in the water, and it is not good. Getting the ratios right so that it kills whatever is in the water but doesn't give you horrible stomach distress is something that's worked out in practice. So they are introducing chemicals in the water, but they're really not ideal, and you'd only want to do them in places where typhoid or other things are sort of constant problems. So you see some of that transition. In terms of the chickens, they will keep chickens. They'll keep livestock of all different kinds. The challenge that they're running into is some places, because of the US military's desire to control Indigenous communities, they're stationing soldiers in places that are very hard to sustain life sometimes. Some of the places you cannot have a post garden. It would be almost impossible to keep livestock, and so you're shipping in food. And the shipping in food is fine, but because it's so expensive, they're shipping it in a couple times a year sometimes. And you can imagine storing meat for 3 months on end gets really foul. So in places that they could, they will absolutely keep livestock or other things. The other thing that they'll do is they will barter salted meat for fresh meat from locals. Fresh meat is obviously much more enjoyable, but for locals who want to keep a supply of food, having access to salted meat is a benefit. But yeah, no, wonderful questions.
My name's Maggie, and I'm researching the history of sex work in Ontario. So I have a question about sex workers and camp followers and whether that factors into desertion rates at all. Just because I noticed in Ontario, during the First World War, when soldiers deserted, the military police would often look for them in brothels. So I'm wondering, how does this play in, if at all?
Yeah, so it's not something that I've done any research on, but my first thought is it will. The Army posts why they think soldiers deserted, which I think are fairly misleading, to be kind. The most common reason is alcohol. Which is certainly an issue, but when they write their annual reports, they'll mention all of these problems and say this probably contributes to desertion. In that same year, it'll be like one person deserted because of food. So there's all sorts of challenges, and desertion is a complex question, right? Are people leaving because they miss their family and because they hate the salted pork and because they're angry at their commander who beats them? But it's something that I should look into because I think that might help explain some of the rates of desertion that you're seeing, and especially where the soldiers go. Yeah, I imagine that's mirrored very, very closely with the US Army.
Jeff Collins, European history. Can you explain a little bit more, I was having trouble following what your kind of thesis is about the arrests and the links? You're suggesting that the arrests are part of an effort to extract resources, or they're acting out of desperation of the soldiers. I was a little confused about what I realize you're still working on it, but what is the kind of working hypothesis?
Yeah, so my working question is, does stationing soldiers in higher concentrations have any impact whatsoever on rates of arrest, rates of dispossession, rates of control? And the idea is to try and overlay 15 or 20 different factors, anything that you could imagine a soldier might have an impact on. Arrests, interracial violence, the speed at which land changes hands, and to see, because we have such a large data set, we have 25,000 soldiers spread across the country, and we have statistics on sort of each level, do we see any change as the US Army redistributes people? And the initial piece that I'm sort of finding is they seem to have much less impact than what I might first imagine.
So it's the provisioning, not number. Okay. I mean, it makes, there's stuff on early modern armies and difficulty they have provisioning. long campaign. Of course, typically what happens, you know, provision the army, they would start pillaging
Yeah.
and stealing.
And,
I guess that's the thesis you work with.
well, it's challenging because you're in your own lands in some ways. And so you don't really want your soldiers pillaging U.S. farms, right? So one of the questions, I guess, is are they pillaging indigenous lands, right? And so that's sort of the next step is figuring out, you know, what are these soldiers doing to get food? And one of the things they're doing is going into debt. They don't get a lot of money, but the army has sort of a supplemental food stores that soldiers are blowing most of their money on. And that's creating an enormous amount of unhappiness, obviously. So the sort of question is, where are these soldiers getting the things they need for life? And some of them aren't. There's some really sad stories about posts that the army writes. You cannot station someone here for more than 1 or 2 years because they'll just be ruined for the rest of their life. That the damage to the people's bodies is so extreme that they put caps on. It's mostly the heat. You know, 110, 120 degree Fahrenheit weather with bad water and bad food is just, it's not the conditions necessary to sustain life. But the trick is, if you want to guard these indigenous areas, if you look here, you have to station troops in places that you might not normally want. So this, for example, the Northwest Mounted Police, one of their jobs is guarding the border, but they're actually guarding a bunch of other nations as well. If we put in indigenous reserves on this map, almost all of the places away from the border are key indigenous communities. And so one of the big takeaways is you're not guarding one border, you're guarding hundreds. And this helps explain why these soldiers are stationed in some really awkward positions.
As a follow-up, how long would soldiers be stationed in? What was the assumption? So I'm interested in that kind of level of, and I know it's probably beyond where you're going right now, but.
Yeah, it's beyond where I'm going right now, partly because the soldiers get moved around a lot. And I don't know that it would be straightforward to track 25,000 individuals, because in some ways you'd want to track all these people moving. You could probably track companies, but the other trick is so many of the soldiers who are listed at a given post are not stationed at a post, and especially in the areas that I'm really interested in. So these are the number of people absent from a given post at a given time. So we've got as many as 135 people missing from some of these key forts that might only have 500 or 600 people stationed. And so it becomes really difficult to say, you know, was this result of the conditions they faced, or were they actually somewhere else for the duration of this time? Were they on patrol? Were they in cities? Some of the soldiers are in cities rather than where they're supposed to be stationed. There's also, to add to the complexity, this is the highest level data you can get. In practice, many of these soldiers get split into smaller temporary camps, which makes it harder to tell, you know, what actually they're eating, what they're being given. Were they essentially on the rations you'd use for military campaigns, or are they getting, you know, home-cooked meals by untrained chefs at the base? So it's a wonderful idea, but hard to rebuild, I think.
So what was the purpose for the military of gathering this information?
Shockingly unclear.
Okay.
So this is the map that started it all. I was really interested in trying to figure out why are all the soldiers absent along the US-Mexico border and almost none of them absent from the US-Canada border. That was sort of the question. Is it climate? Is it supply lines? Is it something that I'm missing? You know, does the Department of Texas grant leaves in a way that they don't grant in the North? And they're frustrating. All they mention is soldiers absent. They don't give you the kind of detail that you're just itching to know.
Because they don't even say absent with their leave.
No.
Right? Oh, they're just saying they're not there.
They're just not there. And so we're trying to figure out, my first thought was, are these soldiers deserted?
Okay.
Especially since I saw the food and water issues, and I don't think that's the case. I think they're being redeployed for reasons that I'm still not clear about. But yeah, the frustration of history.
How do you interpret the numbers when you don't know why they're
Mm-hmm. And the sort of second part of this project that I'm not showing today is the US Census released one of the most frustrating statistics I've ever seen. It is this wonderful taste of violence, which is what I'm sort of long-term project I'm interested in. And it gives the number of Indigenous people killed in wars, and it gives the number of Indigenous people killed in day-to-day engagements, so vigilante violence and other things. And it's specific, it's down to a specific number. And it releases this sometime around 1900, and it goes back all the way to about 1775, I think they're including this. And they post it as a single line in the census, no source, no citation, no idea what at all is happening. And I think we've rebuilt 15 years of it. I think it's from the Department of Indian Affairs, kept, that's what these maps are based on. The Department of Indian Affairs kept somewhat detailed statistics, and they're, I think, interested in, that's where these come from, is that same source where they're tracking violence, but it's only available for about 10 years, 15 years that I can find, and I have no idea where they got the rest of their information. Both the census and the US military are extremely frustrating for giving statistics that clearly are drawn from something and absolutely no indication of what the categories mean or where the data is drawn.
Eric, Canada Cultural History. Be challenged to do this on the national scale, but if you were to zoom in on a specific fort, do you have letters, perhaps personal diaries, maybe even songs in which soldiers would maybe make references to some of the issues you're interested in, water, racial, and so forth?
Yeah, so that's the next step, is I often start at the national level to pick where I want to look. So Fort Clark, Texas, and a few of these other places that show up as aberrations are places that I want to focus in on. There's going to be post records that will talk about desertions and will give more details about how and why people leave. There'll definitely be more detailed descriptions about post water and other problems that I've probably missed at sort of the national level. And then most of all, like you mentioned, diaries from soldiers, which will give that sort of, and songs are a good idea. I hadn't thought of that, but you're likely to see that mentioned in songs as soldiers describe their suffering. So that may give that sort of human element that's sort of missing right now. It's a wonderful idea.
I'm a religion student. I write about famines and included famines as a part of animals and human objects. So I was wondering, in your presentation you have one photograph with animals, cattle bringing some stuff, supply to soldiers and camps, and you also briefly mentioned that like water issues impacted animals. So I just wondered if you could give more understanding how this lack of food also on impacted animals and water supply, and also how it contributed to the growing resentment and desertion in these camps, and also the health of animals, obviously, and diseases among them. And another thing is about, you focused about on food, but what about material supply, like clothes, shoes for soldiers, how this was also added into the picture?
Yeah, these are all amazing questions. So oddly enough, we have probably better information on the animals than on the people. Animals like horses are very expensive, and so the Northwest Mounted Police, for example, kept really detailed records of their horses. How many horses they had, how many died from what causes. I think I'll find something similar with the U.S. Army. But especially if you're living out on the plains, if you don't have a horse, your army is doing nothing, right? And so horses are one of the most important things, but they're not the only one, right? Mules for mule trains to transport supplies, cattle to keep your soldiers alive. All of these animals and camp followers, like the army is much bigger than just the soldiers who are there, right? You have all of these civilian contractors, you have animals, you have camp followers, you have this huge network that's needed to support all of these people. I haven't seen anything to suggest that they track the impact of water directly on horses, but they were very concerned about a lack of forage and other hay and other things that you needed to sustain horses. But it's undoubtable that if humans are struggling and dying from the water that they're being given, that animals would do so as well. And so that might be something that we can overlay, is looking at animal deaths over time in some of the places that are the worst. I'm forgetting your second question.
Are clothes and shoes the material supply
Yeah,
of soldiers?
Yeah, so we have some pieces of this easily accessible that we've already done. The easiest one is housing. I didn't talk about it here, but the houses that soldiers are in are abysmal. They're sometimes as little as like a rickety tent, all the way up to sort of nice buildings. And you can see that with a lack of trees in the area or other things where if you need to import every sort of branch and every piece of lumber, the soldiers are often struggling a lot more than in areas that, when in doubt, they could always go out with an axe and chop some wood. So there's definitely a heavy divergence of access to pieces of material culture, clothing, things like that. And the same is true in Canada. I think we think of the Northwest Mounted Police as having these brilliant, bright red tunics, right? That is not what they looked like in the 19th century. They're not even given hats and mitts in some cases. They're getting frostbite. They're so cold that they're burning cords and cords of wood in houses that have bad ventilation are getting all sorts of respiratory illnesses. So, I think we sort of romanticize the lives of these soldiers, but being a soldier or a sailor, at least at this time period, is one of the last choices I would make. It would be, if I was choosing between that and a mine, I would choose soldiering. But other than that, I think it would be my last choice. The people who enter the force, not the officers live a different life, but the rank and file men, they enter the force often quite poor, and they leave the force quite poor and sometimes with broken bodies.
Yeah, I had a question about, do we see any evidence of Indigenous people playing a role in provisioning any of these posts? Certainly from my research in the early 19th century with the Hudson's Bay Company, Northwest Company, we see a lot of Indigenous provisioners, bringing in country produce. And not only that, but perhaps even making snowshoes or moccasins for some of these posts up in Montana. On the other hand, I can see this not being the case because, as you were saying, some of these supply lines are bringing in treaty payments and rations for Indigenous people. So much different situation, I guess, in the late 19th century, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, so this is like most cool historical questions, really complicated. And it's going to differ by post and by time, but absolutely. So the Northwest Mounted Police are the group that I have actual evidence for. Indigenous people supply all kinds of food and other supplies to the Northwest Mounted Police, and they do it for sometimes very personal reasons, but also strategic ones. And the same is true for the U.S. military. When the Canada-U.S. border is being created, for example, many of the groups who are trying, especially in the States, so the bison start dying off in Canada first, which means the groups in the north who want access to the food have to cross into the south, not only crossing the Canada-U.S. border, but crossing into Indigenous lands that aren't their own. And some of those groups will supply scouts, they'll supply food, they'll supply information to reinforce the Canada-U.S. border, to make soldiers more effective, not because they care about the Canada-U.S. border, but they want competing groups off their land. And so groups will make strategic choices to reinforce their own territorial autonomy by helping the U.S. military strategically in certain cases. So that's the example I know is sort of up by the Canada-U.S. border, but I imagine you'll see something very similar in the U.S.-Mexico border and in other regions as well.
Yeah, hi, my name is Aditi, and my question is, why did they not use fish at all in the famous canned fish as a long history or salted fish? I'm just curious about that. I didn't know anything about it.
My guess is that pork is cheap. Almost all the decisions the U.S. military is making is based on cost. They're desperately trying to get the ration as cheap as possible, and we're talking like getting tenths of a cent off the rations. So one of the things I didn't mention is the ration is very different depending on the region. You wouldn't send salted pork all the way across the country if there was a source of salted fish nearby. But this is one of the reasons it's really hard to figure out what people are actually eating, because there's a whole host of substitutions. You might substitute out the beef or the pork for fish, but you might also substitute out all of their vegetables for something that doesn't provide what a vegetable does. And so you get these soldiers who are getting all sorts of weird malnourishment The vegetables are especially problematic. Almost all of the reports mention that soldiers are not getting enough vegetables, and if they just gave them vegetables, they would do a lot better. But you can imagine storing vegetables is really tricky, right? You can can them or salt them or other things. But getting fresh vegetables, that requires a post garden for the most part, or nearby farmers. But if you're sending the US military out in advance of settlement to try and pressure groups into ceding land, right, you're not going to have as many farmers out in that area. And so the soldiers at the sort of furthest edges of the frontier are often facing really challenging conditions. And they're also not friends with the people that they're taking land from, right? So you can imagine those are situations where you don't get the kind of cooperation that you might see in the Canada-US border situation.
Rebecca Manley, and I'm a Russianist and started the Soviet Union. I was shocked by the desertion rates, and really struck by how challenging it was to get something so basic as water, and wondered if you have information about the sort of the prospecting and the work that went into placing these. I mean, some of these photographs, they look like they're in landscapes that would be so hard to source with food. So are there people who are going and looking at, I mean, is it only military calculi that are determining the exact placement, and what kind of work was it to situating these farms?
Yeah, so I don't know the full answer, but the one sort of piece to sort of take away is they will fail many times when picking post locations, and they will abandon them very quickly. The biggest one that seems to determine where they're going to station a post is water, and that makes just good sense. Like, you need so much water so often that if you don't have access to a good water source, it's almost impossible to keep. And the problem with water is rivers have this awful habit of drying up in certain seasons. And so a post that you settled at one time period that looked great suddenly becomes unmanageably bad. Or there's runoff that suddenly pulls stuff that you don't want into your water supply. And so in practice, they'll make these posts and then they will tough them out for a year or two. And if necessary, they then move them. And that makes it really challenging to do any of this mapping, because you have to pay attention not just to the post name, but where was that post actually located. Sometimes it will be as simple as swapping the post to the other side of the river. But sometimes they'll move this post with the same name a fair distance away, or they'll abandon a post and relocate it. And so it's this sort of military calculi between the logistics necessary to sustain the lowest levels of life with these strategic aims about wanting to control movement. And so it's just this awkward in-between, I think.
Can I ask another question, which is not a follow-up, but it's separated and it's about where you're going? If I understood correctly from the graph or the maps and from your comments, what you're finding is that where you have a heavier presence of U.S. soldiers, you're not seeing as many incidents of violence between Indigenous communities and settlers. And so I wondered if I understood that correctly, and if you're going to then be looking at how the absence of soldiers impacts dynamics and how the presence of soldiers, while it is in itself a form of violence, precludes other forms of violence.
Yeah, so that was my initial thought, was that where you see soldiers, you would see less interracial violence. But I didn't find any pattern at all. It seems that soldiers have very little impact, if any. This is kind of hard to gauge as well, because what you'll see is an episode of violence, and then the next year, more soldiers stationed there. And so the question is, did that prevent future instances of violence? And that's one of those really frustrating things about history, is I can't go back and simulate what would have happened without those soldiers. But what I will say is large concentrations of soldiers don't seem to prevent it. Violence is going to happen for reasons that are often very local in nature, and these sort of national level focuses on military had less of an impact than I thought it would on things like violence, or even on things like arrests. I think that's being handled by the Department of Indian Affairs, and so the next step is overlaying their numbers on this picture and seeing, does the placement of Indian agents actually shape violence or dispossession, if soldiers aren't the ones who I initially would have thought would be really responsible for this.
My question is, when do things get better, and if they do? Because this is a story of suffering, lack of resources, but all those things are also not accidental, they are decisions. So when do governments decide the resources are better, for what reason?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So some of these problems, as I hope the sort of first story that I told you about my uncle, don't get better. Even into the Vietnam War, soldiers are still complaining about awful food, but the problems change. Where I think you see soldiers doing the best is during times of war, in terms of the food that they're given. The Army will drastically change the amount of rations given to soldiers during the Civil War, increasing it, and then they'll drop it back down as if the human body suddenly needs less during times of peace. And it's tricky. It's really, really tricky because a soldier who's moving lumber all day needs a lot more food than a soldier who sits at the base or does light patrols. And so in times of war, they may actually need slightly more rations. But that's where you see sudden increases in investment, not just overall, but per capita per soldier. But it's also tricky because people skim off, like the civilian suppliers skim off more profit sometimes. And you see more money being wasted because there's less checks and balances, I guess, because you're just trying to keep an army in the field. And so I guess I have two answers to that. One is some things I don't think ever get better. I think this is just sort of the lot of soldiers, is that they're given food that's only ever given to prisoners and soldiers. It's often very, very low quality. And then some things I think will change when the US becomes very, very interested in military success, rather than just maintaining sort of a rough web of power.
So, how much of that is of the better provisioning of soldiers during the Civil War, for instance, or Spanish-American War, or World War I, has to do with more determination on the part of the War Department, and how much of it has to do with funding?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not trying to take away from the skimpiness of the War Department, but money, they have to get the money from someplace.
Yeah, I mean, when you suddenly give more money to the War Department, they're able to do a much better job. The US is stuck in sort of a weird position during the 19th century where, unlike Europe, which maintains these large standing armies, the US wants this very, very small government. Especially in the aftermath of the Civil War, they dropped down from hundreds of thousands of soldiers to a pretty small, about 25,000 through much of this time period. It's a relatively small force, which in theory should make it much easier to sustain. Right? This should be a much, much cheaper force than some of the forces that are in Europe, and yet it seems to struggle even though during the Civil War it's able to maintain just incredibly high levels of military success. So I think you're right, that I think some of this is just a willingness to spend money.
And so that makes it a political problem as well as a logistical problem in the War Department.
Yeah.
And so do you see a surge in better provisioning, not just in armies in the field, but also armies in the West during the Spanish-American War, for instance, during World War I, as just the budget goes up?
So I haven't gone all the way to World War I, which is where I think you'd see that big spike. I'd be surprised if you saw huge changes during the Spanish-American War, just because it's so short. That I think you'd see them in certain locations, but I don't know that you'd see them in, say, the American West. But World War I think that's where we need to go next. We have data until right before World War I. So that might be the next step, is to push that into World War I to see how much of this changes per capita and other things like that. Yeah.
I see when I teach media history. I wonder if you could say something about how you locate your project historiographically. I hear military history, I hear history of settler-colonialism, food history maybe, but I'm wondering, how do you locate? What are the literature's debates you're engaged in?
This is a great question, and the answer is I have no idea. So I'm in this really weird spot in my career where I need to pick what I'm doing for my second book, and my answer so far has been everything. So right now this is a small piece of what I'm doing, but I'm also reconstructing the entirety of the extradition process, which should be simple, but it's the weirdest system you've ever seen. Neither Canada nor the United States have any idea who's being sent. Their records do not agree on who is sent, for what crime, at what time. And then I'm also rebuilding prisons. And so one of my sort of goals, I think, I'm fundamentally interested in power. How is it that you change people's lives at a continental scale? And so I'm trying to rebuild many different institutions that have an impact. So the first book looked at a limited extent military, Northwest Mounted Police, customs, immigration. Right now I'm working on prisons, the extradition system, looking at how countries project power into lands they don't control. And so for me, that's what links all of this together is prisons control people, especially people from foreign countries, is sort of the focus on that. The extradition system pulls people from a country you don't control back in, and the military gives you control over land that is not yours. And so it draws on all different kinds of historiographies, I suppose. So you've mentioned quite a few, but political history is going to be one, legal history is another, Indigenous history. And I guess my approach is to start with an interesting challenge or something that I can't figure out. And then I go and I find the tools that help me solve that problem. So I'm not wedded to a particular approach. If gender history helps me understand this, I'll pick up the fields and the literature on gender history. And so this is very, very early on. Maybe in 5 or 6 years I can tell you, I finally found the tool that solves or answers this question. But for now, I'm reading a little bit on all of these different fields and trying to figure out what helps me understand why soldiers seem to be less effective than I thought they might be.
I study Canadian history. I think I know you've used board games in the classroom pedagogically. I'm just curious if you think there's any good examples of logistics in board games, things that board games get wrong. I really try to get your message across and you implement in the classroom.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, I'm a very weird historian. I fell in love with history without loving reading. Reading is one of my least favorite things to do. I love learning, but I fell in love with history not by reading books, but by playing games. So I learned some of my early excitement about history through games like Civilization and Age of Empires. And what I've noticed is that I'm not alone in that many people find the sort of circuitous route into history from fields other than, for mediums other than reading. That might be watching movies or games or other things. And I guess one of my frustrations is that historians end up talking to a very small section of people because they don't necessarily create the media that people want to engage in. So I'm really interested in building games, custom-built games to teach history. I've got one on smuggling in the Puget Sound region, trying to teach things that I really struggle with teaching, like empathy, or the idea that if you were put in a certain situation, you too would become a criminal. And you even say that to people, but if you create a system that someone interacts with and they make the choice for themselves, I think it hits on a different level. I built a game, an escape room style game, so like a puzzle game, to teach about thesis statements and other things that I suck at teaching, citations, things that are just boring to teach about. And then I'm working on one right now on settler-colonialism in the prairies, to try and have people understand why some groups succeeded as farmers and some didn't. But to go to your sort of bigger question, what commercial off-the-shelf games can be used? Academy Games has a line of games that are all really interesting. They have one on 1812, one on 1775. The one that I find really interesting is Freedom Underground Railway, about the slavery. And what I think is really interesting about games is they can get almost everything wrong and still be really useful in the classroom. So Freedom Underground Railway is really interesting in that if you keep slaves in the South and the room for slaves gets exceeded, people die. And that doesn't make any sense, right? These plantations could have many, many more slaves. But the sort of push, though, is that you must always be moving people north. But there's this sort of, the game mechanics don't make any historic sense, but the sort of trend and the feeling, I think they got right. And what I find really interesting about games is you see people making visceral decisions in a way that I don't see when I lecture to people. So in that game, for example, there are often moves that will give you the most number of victory points, but they require you sending one person back into slavery. And I've played with people who, under no circumstance, in no way or whatsoever, every other game I've played with them, they want their victory points and be damned what I do to get them. But in a game like that, they will make a different choice because they refuse to send someone back into slavery. And so that's, I think, what I find really captivating about games is finding games that create a feeling rather than, say, replicating exact, getting the material culture necessarily right. If you can get people to feel what people felt in the past, I think games have an enormous potential in the classroom and also for engaging the public and getting people to get a sense of the past in a way that's not really possible in film or books or other media. But we can chat after about specific recommendations.